LSD, or Lysergic acid diethylamide, is thought to be an extensively researched hallucinogenic drug. It's extremely potent, illegal, and is better known as acid. Its effects have been described on a wide spectrum, from stimulating to mind-altering, to bad trips and paranoia. Some people say it was life-changing for them, while others don't notice any long-term impact. Lysergic acid diethylamide belongs to a class of drugs known as hallucinogens. It's a clear, white, odorless material, and it has many other street names, including acid, blotters, dots, and yellow sunshine. It's produced in illegal, clandestine labs. It was first made by Albert Hoffman in Switzerland in 1938 from ergotamine, a chemical that's found in the fungus ergot, which grows on rye and other grains. The psychoactive effects of LSD were discovered in 1943, and it was introduced as a drug for research purposes under the trade name Lsd in 1947. Possession of LSD was made illegal in the US in 1968. According to the National Survey on Drug Use and Health, more than 22 million people, or 9% of the population, have used LSD at least once in their life. Most people use LSD for recreation and social reasons. Some say they take it for spiritual reasons, hoping that an LSD trip will provide them with new insights about their life. However, the effects of LSD are highly unpredictable, and they can be a terrifying experience for certain people. A bad trip is sometimes described as a living hell. Some researchers think while the drug is widely abused, it doesn't appear to be addictive. This is likely because many people avoid it after having a bad or an unpredictable experience. A research paper from 1968 states that a tolerance to LSD develops rapidly in humans, but is easily lost. Back then, they described withdrawal symptoms, including slight restlessness and irritability, as absent or mild. However, recent research points to hallucinogen persisting perception disorder, which is when hallucinogenic effects, distorted perception, and flashbacks persist longer after the trip is over. Although rare, this hallucination persisting perception disorder is hard to treat, and it can lead to lifelong disability due to mental health disturbances. People say LSD intoxication may cause increased sensory perception and mental imagery, illusionary changes of perceived objects, synesthesia, to taste sounds, smell colours, or see scents. They mention how emotions can be intensified, thoughts can be accelerated, and their scope usually broadened, including new associations and modified interpretation and meaning of relationships and objects. Another aspect that users mention is a weakening of ego identification. Various authors have compared the psychedelic state of consciousness to a daydream, but one that can quickly turn into a nightmare. See The Doors of Perception, Heaven and Hell, the book by Aldous Huxley. Recent researchers have been investigating the effects of LSD and other psychedelics for end-of-life anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, cancer, and addiction treatment. Albert Hoffman first synthesized LSD in 1938. Allegedly, the main intention of the synthesis was to obtain a respiratory and circulatory stimulant. It was set aside for 5 years, until 1943, when Hoffman decided to re-examine it. He said that while re-synthesizing the LSD, he accidentally absorbed a small quantity to his fingertip and thus discovered its effects. He said he was affected by a remarkable restlessness, combined with a slight dizziness. At home, I lay down and I sank into a non-unpleasant, intoxicated-like condition, characterized by an extremely stimulated imagination. In a dreamlike state, with eyes closed, I found the daylight to be unpleasantly glaring. I perceived an uninterrupted stream of fantastic pictures, extraordinary shapes with an intense kaleidoscopic play of colours. After some 2 hours, this condition faded away. 3 days later, Hoffman performed a self-experiment to determine the effects of LSD, intentionally ingesting 250 micrograms of the substance, an amount he predicted to be a threshold dose. An actual threshold dose is only 20 micrograms. Less than an hour later, Hoffman experienced sudden and intense changes in perception. He asked his lab assistant to escort him home, and as the use of motor vehicles was prohibited because of wartime restrictions, they made the journey on a bicycle. On the way, Hoffman's condition rapidly deteriorated as he struggled with feelings of anxiety, alternating in his belief that the next-door neighbour was a malevolent witch, that he was going insane, and that the LSD had poisoned him. When the house doctor arrived, however, he couldn't detect any physical abnormalities, apart from a pair of incredibly dilated pupils. Hoffman was reassured, and soon his terror began to give way to a sense of good fortune and enjoyment, as he later wrote. Little by little, I could begin to enjoy the unprecedented colours and plays of shapes that persisted behind my closed eyes. Kaleidoscopic, fantastic images surged into me, alternating, variegated, opening and then closing themselves in circles and spirals, exploding in coloured fountains, rearranging and hybridizing themselves in a constant flux. Hoffman considered that LSD may have value as a psychiatric tool because of its intense and introspective nature. He couldn't imagine anyone would use it recreationally. He later summarized his thoughts about psychedelics, including LSD and psilocybin, in a book, LSD, My Problem Child. Studies suggest that LSD is an activator of serotonin receptors in the locus coeruleus, the RAF nuclei, and the cortex. The hallucinogenic effect of the LSD has been linked to its affinity for the serotonin receptor. According to some research, LSD at high doses decreases the dopaminergic neural activity in the ventral tegmental area, the main source of dopaminergic neurons in the brain implicated in the pathogenesis of psychosis. Lsd Assisted Psychotherapy reduced anxiety associated with life-threatening disease in one recent study of 12 advanced stage cancer patients in a medically supervised safe environment. Treatment included drug-free psychotherapy sessions and 2 LSD-assisted psychotherapy sessions 2 to 3 weeks apart. At the 2-month follow-up, anxiety was significantly reduced. No acute or chronic adverse effects persisted beyond 1 day after the treatment, or treatment-related serious adverse events. Anxiety reductions were sustained for 12 months. However, the study included only 12 people and no solid conclusions could be drawn from this. Studies from the 60s suggested LSD might reduce pain and improve sleep in cancer patients. However, these studies all suffer from methodological flaws and small sample sizes. None of the findings have been verified. One research group recently postulated that LSD might reduce psychological pain in terminally ill by breaking the cycle of anticipating the pain and helping people to cope with the fear of death. In a recent within-subject placebo-controlled study, healthy volunteers who were administered intravenous LSD at 40 to 80 micrograms gave a significantly higher rating of creative imagination scale. These results suggest that LSD enhances the influence of suggestion, which may have implications in psychotherapy. The authors of the study found that suggestions must be of sufficient duration and length of detail to be enhanced by the drug. Individuals with high trait conscientiousness were especially sensitive to the suggestibility-enhancing effects of the LSD. In a 2016 placebo-controlled, double-blind, random-order crossover study, 100 micrograms of LSD was given to 24 subjects and 200 micrograms of LSD to 16 subjects, aged 25 to 65 years old. It produced feelings of happiness, trust, closeness to others, enhanced explicit and implicit emotional empathy. The scientists hypothesized the LSD acutely impaired fear recognition and enhanced emotional empathy and sociability. However, no other recent studies looked into the effects of LSD on suggestibility, social skills, or empathy. In one study from the 60s involving 24 healthy participants, suggestibility was significantly enhanced by LSD and mescaline. In another, similarly limiting study, LSD improved suggestibility in hospitalized patients with neurosis and schizophrenia, but less so in patients with depression. The use of hallucinogens like LSD for addiction is highly controversial. The risk of such practices are high, and clinical data is sparse. A meta-analysis of controlled trials suggested that hallucinogens and high-dose LSD should be further studied in the treatment of addictions, since they show some potential. According to a 2012 quantitative meta-analysis of 536 participants and 6 trials, the LSD may have some positive effects. However, large-scale controlled trials are lacking. One study reviewed the use of LSD in the treatment of drug dependencies, and the authors considered that it might help in the recovery of drug dependency, possibly involving a serotonin mechanism. Surveys indicate that hallucinogens have been increasingly used by cluster headache patients outside of physician recommendation, mainly to abort a cluster period. The use of hallucinogens for headaches is controversial, and only sporadic reports mention it. No proper trials have been conducted yet. According to a group of researchers who interviewed 53 cluster headache patients, 7 of 8 LSD users reported the cluster period termination, and 4 to 5 users reported an extension of no symptoms. According to one study and recent behavioral and neuroimaging data, it suggests that psychedelics like LSD can modulate neural circuits that have been implicated in mood disorders. Some scientists believe they hold potential for reducing the clinical symptoms of the disorders, but clinical studies are lacking. Researchers were interested in LSD's potential mechanism. In animal models, LSD affects serotonin in the brain, rebalance of hippocampal 5-HT2A to 5-HT1A signaling. We don't know how and if LSD affects creativity. The only available findings are based on anecdotal experiments that were carried out in the 60s. Although interesting to some, no valid conclusions can be drawn from the experiments. It was extremely easy to study LSD and other psychedelics back then, and researchers didn't need any sort of approval. One such scientist gave LSD to artists at the time and claimed to have documented the process. This was Oscar Janiger, a California-based psychiatrist. In one study, he gave LSD to a mixed group of 60 visual artists over a 7-year period. He said the artists produced over 250 drawings that were demonstrated to be improved by the LSD. Aspects of the artist's work that counted as improved were highly subjective descriptions like more expressionism, sharpening colour, greater freedom from prescribed mental sets, increased syntactical organisation, deeper accessibility of past impressions, and a heightened sense of emotional excitement. In another study from the 50s, a group of researchers claimed that LSD improved the work of graphic artists. In a 1966 pilot study in a group of individuals engaged in various industries like engineers, theoretical mathematicians, physicists, architects, and designers, the author said that LSD improved the creativity. In 1967, experiments conducted on 19 graduate students. Creative test data was allegedly improved by the LSD. Some researchers issued reports of the use of LSD in the treatment of children with autism, mostly between 1959 and 1974. Several positive outcomes were reported with its use, but most of the studies lack proper experimental controls, and they present largely experimental narrative data. The several studies which were based on the modification of autistic behaviour with LSD-25, and also the treatment of autistic schizophrenic children with LSD-25 and UML-491. Researchers wanted to determine if LSD, as an activator of serotonin receptors, blocks inflammatory effects of tumour necrosis factor alpha, induced expression of pro-inflammatory cell adhesion molecules, cytokines and chemokine genes, and the expression of VCAM1 protein. They are carrying out research in cells and animals. Some scientists are also investigating its effects on the production of interleukin-6 in the cells. A study by researchers from the University of Alabama at Birmingham and Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine collected data on 25,622 individuals under community correction supervision in treatment accountability for safer communities, and they found that hallucinogen use predicted a reduced likelihood to fail the program. Results suggest that hallucinogens can promote alcohol and other drug abstinence and pro-social behavior in a population with high rates of recidivism or repeat addictive behavior. Another controversial experiment, the Concord prison experiment, dates back to the 60s, and it was led by the famous psychedelic advocate Timothy Leary. Leary claimed that compared to the average recidivism rate of 60% for American prisoners in general, the rate for those involved in his project dropped to 20%. He believed a combination of psilocybin and group psychotherapy should be used in all prisoners. Some researchers think, just like psilocybin and peyote, LSD can increase beta brainwaves, which are associated with alertness and awareness, and LSD increases the variability of brainwaves. Limited data from the 60s suggests that chronic LSD users who took 15 to 300 total doses have an increase in energy for all brainwaves, accompanied by a faster reaction time. In one small anecdotal study, 22 mental health professionals who self-experimented with LSD were interviewed. They didn't report long-term negative effects, but it's impossible to draw valid data from this experiment. Case reports of long-term psychiatric problems attributed to LSD include psychosis, panic attacks, and other anxiety disorders and oppression. Animals who are given LSD long-term develop symptoms of schizophrenia. A side effect associated with the use of LSD is the particular or total recurrence of perceptual disturbance, which previously appeared during the intoxication, despite the absence of the recent use. The term commonly referred to as a flashback or hallucinogen persisting perception disorder. 2 case reports of patients with a prior history of LSD turned to psychiatric consultations following episodes of the hallucinogen persisting perception disorder. Another report describes the use of LSD among alcoholism treatment facility inpatients and a degree of subjective distress experienced during the flashbacks. LSD can cause a loss of appetite, sleeplessness, pupil dilation, dry mouth, salivation, flushing of the face, excessive sweating, nausea, inner trembling. It can also increase body temperature, heartbeat, blood pressure, and blood sugar. LSD produces intense effects in extremely small quantities. The minimal recognizable dose of LSD in humans is about 25 micrograms. Clinical trials considered a dose for the typical LSD reaction to be in the range of 100 to 200 micrograms. LSD is generally taken orally. After ingestion, LSD is completely absorbed in the gut. After 100 to 250 micrograms of LSD, psychological and physical effects peak after 1.5 to 2.5 hours, although the effects are felt for hours afterwards. The effects of LSD can usually last up to 8 hours. A 2017 review of 2 clinical studies found a 100 microgram dose, the maximum blood concentration of 1.3 nanograms per milliliter, and the time to reach the maximum blood concentration was 1.4 hours. It had a half-life of 2.6 hours. The subjective effects lasted for 8 hours plus or minus 2 hours, and the subjective peak effects lasted for 2.8 hours. For a 200 microgram dose, an average maximum blood concentration of 3.1 nanograms per milliliter was reached. The time to reach the maximum concentration was 1.5 hours. It had a half-life of 2.6 hours. A subjective effect duration of 11.6 plus or minus 1.7 hours, and a subjective peak effect of 2.5 hours. In summary, after oral administration of LSD, it takes around 1.5 hours to reach the maximum concentration in the body, 2.5 hours to produce the effects, and the effects can last anywhere from 8.2 to 11.6 hours depending on the dose. At this time, LSD should only be used in clinical trials while being monitored by a medical professional. For more information about herbs, supplements, or natural treatment plans, check out my website.